Imagine waking up strapped to a table, not for surgery, but for an experiment where doctors time how long it takes for you to die. No anesthesia, no mercy. Just meticulous notes about your suffering in the name of science. Welcome to Unit 731, Imperial Japan's most horrifying secret of World War II. Tier 1, Surface Level, the basics. Imperial Japan's crowning scientific achievement wasn't electronics or engineering. It was figuring out how many ways humans could be taken apart. Unit 731, officially Japan's Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, which prevented epidemics roughly the way chainsaws prevent headaches. A name so aggressively mundane you'd think they were installing water filters and handing out hand sanitizer. And that's exactly the point. After all, who's suspicious of water purification? No one. The perfect cover for what would become the doom of 400,000 people. And ironically, the savior of millions more through medical advancements built on unimaginable suffering. Their little house of horrors wasn't hidden in some remote jungle. It was built in Pingfang, a district of Harbin in Japanese-occupied Manchuria. Far enough from prying eyes, but connected enough to ship in an endless supply of human guinea pigs. For 10 straight years, while Hitler was stealing the spotlight with his more theatrical brand of evil, Unit 731 operated in the shadows. 10 years, 3,652 days of methodical, documented cruelty. This wasn't a weekend of wartime passion. This was a carefully maintained program with quarterly performance reviews and Employee of the Month awards for whoever made the most prisoners scream. Official details. The mastermind? Meet Shirō Ishii, microbiologist, medical doctor, and architect of systematic suffering. A man who convinced an empire that science without conscience was just good time management. Educated at Kyoto Imperial University, Ishii wasn't some backwater butcher. He represented Japan's intellectual elite. Turns out the gap between brilliant and monster is smaller than we'd like to admit. All it takes is someone removing the guardrails of morality and replacing them with military funding. On paper, Unit 731 was just another R&D facility developing defensive measures against disease. In military shorthand, they called it Manchuria 731, because a house with screams wouldn't fit neatly on government letterhead. Easier to say, easier to write, easier to think about. The same way we abbreviate corporations or government agencies. Nobody has to say, I work at the Human Experimentation Laboratory where we remove people's organs while they're still conscious. Just 731. Much cleaner for business cards. What a convenient cover story. Who doesn't want protection from epidemics? Especially in the 1930s, when the Spanish flu was still a fresh trauma. The research was real. The development was real. They just forgot to mention the part where humans were the lab rats. The Kwantung Army, Japan's elite fighting force in Manchuria, gave Unit 731 everything it needed. Protection, funding, and most importantly, freedom from oversight. Military police staffed the facility, ensuring that the only people who entered without permission never left at all. The budget? 10 million yen. About $200 million in today's currency. That's what an empire decided human suffering was worth investing in. Budget meetings were held. Funding was approved. Expenses were tracked. Some accountant processed the paperwork for equipment that would be used to freeze, infect, and dissect living people. Evil with a spreadsheet is still evil, just more efficiently organized. The Murder Archipelago. Unit 731 wasn't flying solo in the atrocity business. It was a flagship of Japan's biological warfare fleet. Unit 516 focused on chemical weapons. Unit 100 specialized in animal-based diseases. This Murder Archipelago stretched across occupied China, each island more nightmarish than the last. Together, they formed a charming ecosystem of evil, sharing research subjects and findings like universities share academic papers. Hey, we're done with this batch of prisoners. They've been infected with the plague. Want to see what happens when you add mustard gas to the mix? Physical and structural scope. Unit 731 wasn't just a lab. It was a small city dedicated to systemic suffering, spanning 6 square kilometers, 150 buildings purpose-built for exploring every possible way the human body could be destroyed. The architects designed special prison cells to maximize observation while minimizing the prisoner's humanity. Small enough to prevent full movement, transparent enough to allow constant monitoring, arranged to prevent communications between captives. Someone drafted these blueprints. Someone calculated the minimum space a human being needs to survive without the comfort of being able to stretch. They didn't just use standard medical tools, they invented new ones, specifically to inflict precise forms of suffering. Pressure chambers with viewing ports for watching lungs collapse, temperature-controlled restraint systems for frostbite studies, centrifuges built to human scale. Imagine being the engineer who designed these devices, walking your boss through the blueprints. As you can see, we've added reinforced glass here so researchers can observe the subject's facial expressions during organ removal. The faculty: 3,000 researchers. Not 10, not 50. 3,000 educated professionals who woke up each morning, put on their lab coats, and went to work turning human beings into science projects. The banality of evil doesn't get more banal than a campus-sized facility with its own cafeteria, where doctors could discuss the day's vivisections over lunch. These weren't backwoods quacks, but Japan's medical elite. University professors and physicians who decided the Hippocratic Oath worked better as toilet paper. The brightest minds from Tokyo Imperial University, Kyoto Imperial University, and other elite institutions competed for spots at Unit 731. Not forced assignment, voluntary application, often with recommendation letters from professors. Dear Unit 731, I'm writing to recommend Hiroshi Tanaka, who has shown exceptional promise in his studies and would make an excellent addition to your organ harvesting team. New staff underwent orientation programs where they observed procedures before participating. Training manuals explained protocols for restraining struggling subjects and proper documentation methods. The most disturbing aspect? The high retention rate. Few requested transfers out. Many volunteered to extend their rotations. Every atrocity was methodically documented with the precision of a corporate quality control program. Standardized forms, photographic evidence, statistical analysis. These weren't the chaotic actions of sadists, they were the methodical procedures of scientists who simply decided ethics was inefficient. Human logistics. Unit 731 had a steady supply of special consignment, their term for human cargo. Regularly scheduled train cars with humans categorized as freight, complete with shipping manifests and inventory numbers. The rail administrators who arranged these transports knew exactly what cargo they were moving. They just filed it under miscellaneous biological materials and made sure the paperwork was properly stamped. Selection criteria were established based on experimental needs. Male subjects, 20 to 25, minimum weight 60 kilos, no prior illness, required for pressure testing. Might appear on the same supply request as demands for test tubes and culture media. Humanity reduced to inventory. The Kempeitai, or Japanese military police and local puppet governments, supplied a steady stream of victims, mostly Chinese but also Korean, Russian, and even some allied POWs. Sometimes entire villages would be requisitioned for public health work, hidden in plain sight. The genius of Unit 731's cover story was its partial truth. They did study water purification and epidemic prevention. They just happened to study it by deliberately causing epidemics and seeing how many villages they could depopulate. Most brilliantly, Unit 731 operated in plain sight by publishing sanitized versions of their findings in respectable medical journals. The facility even gave tours to visiting dignitaries, carefully avoiding the basement rooms where prisoners had their organs removed while fully conscious. When you look at old photos, Unit 731 resembles a normal research campus. Laboratories, dormitories, administrative buildings. That's the most disturbing part. Evil doesn't always wear a warning label. Sometimes it looks like a water purification plant, staffed by doctors who go home each night to their families, having spent the day measuring how long it takes human lungs to collapse when filled with horse blood. Industrial-scale incinerators operated day and night to dispose of the evidence. The ash were often mixed with coal dust and dumped into the Songhua River. Someone calculated the ideal fuel-to-body ratio for maximum efficiency. Someone designed ventilation systems to handle the smoke output without drawing attention. The Japanese government denied its existence for decades, then called it defensive research, then blamed rogue elements. But some truths refused to stay buried, even when empires wished they would. And that's just the surface level of the Unit 731 iceberg. The water gets much, much darker below. Tier 2. Human Experimentation. Early atrocities. The logs. But before we can dive deeper, we need to understand how Unit 731 scientists live with themselves. The answer is surprisingly simple. They stopped seeing their victims as human. Japanese scientists classified their victims as maruta, meaning logs, because that's what happens when you need to sleep at night after what you've done all day. You pretend people are just pieces of wood. Chinese civilians, Russians, Koreans, Pacific Islanders, and even Allied POWs were harvested from nearby prisons and countryside. Men, women, elderly, not even children were spared. Special preference went to the intellectually gifted, because apparently watching smarter brains dissolve in chemical baths yielded superior data. Staff developed an entire vocabulary of dehumanization. Prisoner transfers were deliveries. Dissections became consumption. Death certificates listed cause of death as disposed of. The Japanese scientists didn't just kill their subjects, they erased their humanity before the first incision. But what did they actually do with these human logs? Let's start with something refreshingly familiar to anyone who's experienced winter. Frostbite experiments. You know that burning sensation when your hand gets too cold? Unit 731 researchers wanted to know exactly how much worse it could get. In Manchuria's brutal winters, where temperatures regularly plunged to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, Unit 731 researchers saw opportunity where others saw only suffering. Japanese soldiers fighting in Siberia were dying from frostbite and hypothermia. The solution? Take prisoners outside, soak their limbs in water, and leave them to freeze. Then study how different methods of warming affected tissue damage. Victims, sometimes entire families, were marched naked into the Manchurian winter, their arms and legs repeatedly doused with water until frozen solid. Scientists timed how long various ethnicities lasted before collapse, meticulously documenting the crystallization patterns in human flesh. Russian prisoners lasted longest, a fact noted with clinical fascination in research papers still cited in modern medical literature. The true horror wasn't the freezing, it was the thawing. Dr. Yoshimura Hisato discovered that rapid warming caused more extensive tissue damage. His preferred method? Dunking frozen arms in warm water, peeling back skin, and studying how fast the flesh rotted off the bone. All without anesthesia, of course. Some victims endured daily freeze-thaw cycles for weeks. Their limbs, blackened and gangrenous, were amputated without painkillers, and the process would begin again on remaining extremities. Others had their frozen arms stuck with objects to observe how they shattered like glass. The precise force required was recorded in logbooks with the dispassion of furniture assembly instructions. Perhaps most chilling are the photographs that survived. Researchers posing next to frozen human limbs, examining them with the casual interest of botanists studying an unusual plant specimen. The resulting data on hypothermia treatment was exchanged for immunity at war's end. American flight suits still incorporate these findings. Your tax dollars paid for the research notes written in blood. But freezing people was just the appetizer in Unit 731's buffet of horrors. For the main course, we need to look at something much more invasive. Vivisection without anesthesia. If you thought surgeries were scary with anesthesia, imagine being awake for the whole thing. Now imagine it's not even being done to help you. Vivisection, live dissection, became routine medical practice at Unit 731. Men, women, and children were cut open while fully conscious. Their organs removed one by one as doctors meticulously recorded how long it took them to die. No anesthesia was used, not because it wasn't available, but because it might interfere with results. Apparently, massive trauma responses, shock, and uncontrollable thrashing didn't count as interference. Dr. Kurumizawa Masakuni specialized in removing organs while checking his watch, timing exactly how long humans could survive without each one. The answer for an unsedated liver removal? Precisely 4 minutes and 13 seconds of unimaginable agony, as meticulously documented in his personal diary between lunch notes and complaints about the weather. Live subjects had limbs amputated and reattached to opposite sides of their bodies, intestines extracted and switched with others, stomachs removed, and esophagi sewn directly to intestines. Researchers sipped coffee while watching hearts pump blood to nowhere. Pregnant women endured cesarean sections without painkillers, their fetuses removed, examined, and sometimes vivisected in turn. Some surgeons made bets on how long mother and child would survive the procedure. The most disturbing part? Unit 731's medical notes were immaculate. Pristine diagrams, perfect handwriting, flawless methodology. Modern surgical techniques for treating shock still reference these findings. Your last hospital stay was brought to you by experiments that should make you feel sick just by hearing about them. What makes this particularly disturbing isn't just the cruelty, it's the clinical detachment. Lab notes recovered after the war showed researchers recording victims' reactions with the same emotional investment as weather observations. Subject began screaming at 10:17 a.m., continued until 10:43 a.m. Breathing became irregular at 10:51 a.m. But if you're thinking that's as bad as it gets, well, Unit 731 was just warming up. Let's see what happens when military engineering meets human experimentation. Weapons testing on bound prisoners. Welcome to Unit 731's weapons testing grounds. Prisoners, nicknamed human bullet catchers, were staked to posts, dangled from ceilings, or buried up to their necks, all to answer the pressing scientific question, what happens when different projectiles hit living people? Japanese engineers tested everything, from Nambu pistols to experimental hollow points designed for maximum stopping effectiveness. A polite way of saying messier deaths. Victims were shot with clinical precision, starting at the limbs before moving to vital organs. Researchers measured blood spatter, timed how long victims stayed conscious, and gauged wound depth. Unit 731's grenade research plumbed new depths of depravity. Entire families were bound together to measure crowd dispersal efficiency. Children were placed closest to the blast. Mothers restrained just beyond the kill zone, forced to watch. Researchers discovered that serrated grenade fragments created wounds resistant to clotting, ensuring prolonged suffering. Pregnant women were another fascinating test group. Researchers positioned them at calculated distances from blast zones to see if fetal tissue could act as a human shield. It didn't. The findings directly influenced the redesign of the Type 99 grenade, which incorporated an increased fragment count specifically because Unit 731 data showed that psychological damage to surviving witnesses was directly proportional to the visible wound quantity on victims. Some prisoners survived weeks of tissue penetration tests, their bodies stitched up just enough to keep them alive for another round of fire. Others had their limbs deliberately shattered by fragmentation rounds to assess how well broken bones could heal, as if those victims would ever see medical treatment. Every bullet designed after 1945 carries this legacy, calibrated against the documented death spasms of people who couldn't run. But bullets and bombs were practically humane compared to what awaited prisoners selected for the pressure chambers. Pressure chamber experiments. Ever wondered what happens when the human body meets atmospheric conditions it was never meant to experience? Unit 731 did. Researchers discovered that human eyeballs expand 30% beyond normal size before rupturing at approximately 2.0 atmospheres of pressure, roughly equivalent to the crushing force experienced 33 feet underwater. Children proved particularly valuable subjects due to their structural elasticity, a clinical term for their small bodies deformed more dramatically before failing. The youngest documented victim, a 3-year-old girl, survived pressure equivalent to 7,000 feet of altitude change in 30 seconds before her lungs collapsed. Pregnant women were once again the prized specimens, allowing researchers to monitor 2 subjects simultaneously. Unit 731 documented that fetuses died an average of 4.2 minutes before their mothers during decompression, revolutionizing everything we previously knew about maternal-fetal oxygen transfer. The technical language and lab notes can disguise a nightmare. Subject exhibited subcutaneous emphysema proceeding to pneumothorax. Translation, their skin bubbled as trapped gases expanded before their lungs collapsed and air pockets formed between organs, which then ruptured. Most horrifying were the slow pressure experiments. Victims experienced gradual pressure increases over days, their bodies adapting just enough to prolong suffering. The recordings of these experiments didn't just document results, they captured begging, children crying for parents who were often watching from adjacent chambers, mothers trying to sing lullabies through blood-filled lungs to comfort children they couldn't see. Your next airplane flight features cabin pressure protocols developed from these exact experiments. Safe travels. But if you thought human bodies were only tested under pressure, wait until you see what happened when Unit 731 decided to take them apart piece by piece. Surgical removal of body parts. Prisoners endured surgical amputations while fully conscious. No anesthesia, no sedation, not even a shot of sake for the road. Just cold steel meeting warm flesh while researchers timed how long it took different body parts to die once separated from their owners. Children proved problematic subjects due to their excessive vocalization during procedures. Lab speak for they screamed too loudly while being dismembered. One 9-year-old boy had each finger removed sequentially over 5 days, with researchers measuring nerve regeneration rates between procedures. Women faced uniquely gendered horrors. Breasts were removed to study lactation functions, ovaries extracted to observe hormonal changes, and yes, all without pain relief. The research team discovered that female subjects could survive the removal of 62% of their reproductive organs while maintaining basic consciousness, data that informed Japanese obstetric emergency procedures for decades after the war. Perhaps most disturbing were the symmetrical comparison studies. Victims had matching body parts removed on different days. A left hand on a Monday, a right hand on Wednesday, just to determine how prior trauma affected upcoming procedures. Families were often processed together, with parents forced to watch their children's surgeries before undergoing their own. One researcher noted that a mother's stress response significantly altered her blood chemistry during her daughter's live dissection. Centrifuge testing to death. Before astronauts trained in centrifuges, prisoners died in them. All to answer the pressing question, how many Gs does it take to liquefy a person? A centrifuge creates artificial gravity through rapid spinning. Unit 731's version, a high-speed torture device, engineered to find out exactly when bones would snap, organs would shift, and blood vessels would explode. This wasn't some test tube centrifuge. It was an industrial-grade human blender, a circular chamber lined with restraint chairs, cranking forces up to 20 G, 20 times the Earth's gravity. At 1 G, a 60-kilo human feels like, well, 60 kilos. But crank that up to 20 G, and that same body suddenly weighs 1,200 kilos. Blood becomes so heavy it refuses to circulate, pulling painfully in the limbs, while the brain starves of oxygen. Parents watched helplessly as their children were secured into padded chairs with specially designed 5-point restraints. Scientists discovered that adolescent girls' spines compressed approximately 4.7 centimeters under 16 G forces, while boys of similar age showed only 3.1 centimeter compression, data which informed ejection seat designs that remain in military aircraft today. One of the most disturbing findings came from elderly test subjects, whose brittle bones would audibly snap in sequence during acceleration. Research categorized these sounds as percussion cues for imminent system failure, creating a veritable symphony of breaking bones that allowed precise prediction of when death would occur. Twins were especially valuable, allowing researchers to compare genetics versus environment. One documented case involved identical twin girls, one properly hydrated, the other dehydrated. Result, the dehydrated one's kidneys failed at 9 G. Her twin made it to 12 G. Modern aviation textbooks still cite these findings. At max speed, the centrifuge turned people into smoothies. Organs, bones, and fluids blending together from sheer force. Dental fillings were sometimes found embedded in the walls. Tier 3. Biological and chemical weapon experiments. Plague-infected fleas. Nothing says scientific progress quite like weaponizing the Black Death. Just ask Unit 731's entomology department. The Flea Initiative transformed ordinary parasites into apocalyptic delivery systems. Researchers discovered that human fleas could harbor 24,000 plague bacteria per insect without dying, enough to infect an entire village from just a handful of the hopping horrors. Chinese prisoners served as living incubators, deliberately infected to breed stronger, drug-resistant, successive generations of increasingly virulent plague strains. Their bodies essentially became biological manufacturing plants. The breeding program produced 143 million infected fleas monthly at peak operation. Harvesting these disease factories required workers to literally use vacuum cleaners to suck them off corpses. Prisoners, sometimes still alive, as their skin darkened with dead, decaying tissue. Field tests in Changde and Ningbo killed an estimated 400,000 Chinese civilians. The fleas were dropped in ceramic bombs designed to shatter at low altitude, creating a biological mist that drifted with prevailing winds. Unit 731 researchers discovered that targeting communities during morning market hours maximized infection rates, as the bombs could be timed to release their deadly cargo when population density peaked. The most disturbing finding? Plague-carrying fleas remained viable for up to 15 days after their release, creating a self-perpetuating epidemic that required minimal resources to maintain. Biological warfare on the installment plan. After the war, American scientists eagerly debriefed Unit 731's flea program directors. Your tax dollars at work, purchasing blueprints for Armageddon. Anthrax-Filled Bombs. While most weapons are designed to kill you, Unit 731's anthrax bombs were engineered to ensure that the ground you died on would remain lethal for generations. Bacillus anthracis isn't just any bacteria. It forms hardy spores that can remain active for decades. Unit 731 researchers discovered that ceramic bomb casings preserved spores better than their metal containers, which would heat upon impact and damage the biological payload. Families captured together proved perfect experimental cohorts. Researchers documented that children exposed to aerosolized anthrax typically developed the pulmonary form, dying within 36 hours as their lungs filled with fluid. Adults more commonly develop cutaneous anthrax, black, painless lesions that slowly consumed flesh before the infection turned systemic. The most disturbing discovery? Unit 731 found that pregnant women transferred anthrax antibodies to their fetuses if exposed to sublethal doses, essentially creating immunity in the next generation. This led to dedicated immunity cultivation experiments where women in various stages of pregnancy received calculated anthrax exposures. Testing moved beyond the laboratory in 1940, when an estimated 3,000 prisoners were positioned at various distances from anthrax bomb detonations in Changde. Unit 731 discovered that anthrax spores penetrated cloth masks in approximately 45 seconds, rendering civilian protection measures essentially useless. When Unit 731 disbanded, its bioweapons expert received immunity in exchange for their research. The anthrax bomb data was quietly incorporated into American, Soviet, and British bioweapons programs. Some test sites in Manchuria remain contaminated today. Field testing on Chinese villages. When lab conditions proved too limiting for Unit 731's ambitions, entire Chinese villages became unwitting petri dishes in humanity's largest biological weapons experiment. Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night wasn't poetic. It was a code name for dropping plague-infested fleas on Ningbo in 1940, killing an estimated 99,000 civilians. Unit 731 discovered that airdropping disease vectors at twilight maximize infection rates because villages were home but still awake, allowing rapid person-to-person transmission before anyone realized an attack had occurred. Children became the unwitting vanguards of disease transmission. Researchers discovered that children played communally even when adults fell ill, creating what they clinically termed transmission supernodes, meaning they efficiently spread disease through multiple family units simultaneously. Pregnant women, as usual, offered special research opportunities as Unit 731 discovered that cholera crossed the placental barrier in 63% of cases, creating what they termed multi-generational elimination efficiency. Researchers deployed different pathogens in neighboring villages to compare effectiveness. A plague for Ningbo, cholera for Jinhua, anthrax for Chuzhou, meticulously recording which diseases created the highest mortality to resource ratio. The most disturbing testing protocol involved what Unit 731 termed sequential pathogenic deployment, infecting a village with one disease, documenting the progression, then introducing a second pathogen to observe interaction effects. Zhejiang Province's Yibu village first received typhoid-contaminated well water, followed 3 weeks later by smallpox-infected clothing airdropped into community laundry areas. the resulting mortality rate reached 89.7%. To ensure thorough documentation, medical teams disguised as aid workers entered villages post-attack, photographing symptoms and collecting tissue samples from the dying. Some test sites remain uninhabitable today, their soil still harboring anthrax spores 8 decades later. A monument to science without conscience. Next time someone tells you Japan's only crime was Pearl Harbor, remember the villages that disappeared without a single headline, without even a single footnote in today's history books. Cholera in water supplies. So, you think drinking 8 glasses of water a day is healthy advice? Unit 731's hydration experts had their own recommendation, just enough to liquefy your insides. Their hydration terminal team, points for honest branding, perfected the art of turning ordinary tap water into a doomsday cocktail. They discovered you could pack about 1.3 million cholera bacteria per liter without anyone noticing a thing. No weird taste, no funky smell, just death taking a refreshing swim before wreaking havoc on your intestines. In 1941, they decided the Huzhou Reservoir deserved a little morning pick-me-up of Vibrio cholerae. Timing was everything. They hit at dawn, when treatment chemicals were at their weakest. Within 3 days, kids started dropping first, their tiny bodies basically speedrunning the disease. Each victim became a little bacteria factory, with every bout of diarrhea. We're talking up to 20 liters daily, enough to fill a small aquarium, containing enough bacteria to infect 50 more people. Grandma wiping her grandkid's face? Congratulations, she's now patient 0 2.0. One researcher even coined the term sympathy vectors for mothers who got infected from kissing their dying babies' foreheads. The team even created portable just add cholera kits, regular canteens filled with bacterial slurry that could turn a village, well, into a mass grave, with a few casual drops. Sleeper agents disguised as refugees carried these unassuming death thermoses right past checkpoints. No suspicious packages, no weird equipment, just a thirsty-looking guy with a canteen of doom. And the ultimate dark punchline? After the war, these same researchers helped establish Japan's water safety regulations. That's right. The very people who wrote the book on how to poison water supplies then got jobs making sure it doesn't happen. Your very own tap water is protected by regulations written by those who perfected its contamination. It's like hiring a serial killer as a detective's assistant. Thirsty yet? Maybe stick to bottled water on your next trip abroad. Just saying. Biological agents on crops. But why stop at poisoning water when you can starve entire populations? Welcome to the next level of our descent. Unit 731's Agricultural Warfare Division developed what they called ecological chain disruption, the systematic destruction of food supplies that would continue killing long after bombs stopped falling. Unlike their splashier experiments, like making entire villages shit themselves to death, crop destruction created a silent, creeping death that left no convenient corpses for body counts, just hollow-cheeked children with distended bellies, asking why the rice wouldn't grow. The team engineered a particularly virulent strain of wheat rust that could destroy 85% of crop yields within 2 weeks of application. Field tests in rural Heilongjiang province created artificial famines in carefully mapped villages, allowing researchers to document exactly how long different demographic groups survived on diminishing food supplies. Children under 5 typically lasted just 17 days before succumbing to malnutrition, while pregnant women showed surprising resilience, often outliving elderly males by 12 to 15 days. Information meticulously recorded in leather-bound journals alongside hand-drawn graphs of population decline efficiency. But the true evil genius? Their delivery method. Agricultural saboteurs handed out contaminated seed packets to unsuspecting farmers, labeled as improved varieties from agricultural colleges. One woman, excited about the promised bumper crop, planted the entire gift package, only to watch her family's sole food source wither into black sludge. Researchers photographed her desperate attempts to salvage unaffected plants, noting that subject continues agricultural efforts despite 97% crop failure, demonstrating typical denial response. And the best part? These agents would continue to rot plants for years after the war ended, leaving behind villages full of corpses while the Japanese scientists who created them comfortably resumed academic careers back home. Because nothing says scientific ethics like designing a famine that outlives your war crimes trial. Glanders' bacterial weapons. Destroying food supplies seems too passive? Don't worry. Unit 731 had more direct approaches waiting just below the surface. Glanders, the medieval disease that decimated warhorse population for centuries, found a new purpose in Unit 731's bacterial arsenal. This forgotten plague, caused by Burkholderia malae bacteria, became Japan's bioweapon darling for its horrifying ability to adapt, and its theatrical death process. Though it typically affects horses, it proved catastrophically lethal when deliberately introduced to human populations. Victims develop pustule-covered farcy pipes, basically ropey, swollen lymph vessels that snake beneath their skin like fungus roots, before erupting through flesh, weeping pus from open sores. Researchers created beautiful ceramic dolls with interior chambers containing glanders-soaked cotton. These were distributed to villages with explicit instructions to share them among children. One 8-year-old girl received such a doll as a birthday gift from medical workers visiting her town. Within days, her lymph nodes swelled to the size of eggs. Her breathing became labored, and pus leaked from her eyes. Researchers photographed each stage, coldly noting that subjects' attachment to infection vector persisted even as disease progressed, as the dying child clutched her beautiful poison gift. But it gets darker as we descend. Researchers discovered that women of childbearing age exhibited prolonged survival despite massive infection, seemingly protected by hormonal factors. This led to horrific maternal transmission experiments, where pregnant women were deliberately infected to determine if the bacterium crossed the placental barrier. It did. Most insidiously, Unit 731 weaponized glanders into what they called delayed action infection bombs, specialized ceramic shells containing bacteria suspended in a temperature-resistant glycerol solution. Unlike conventional explosives, these weapons were designed not for immediate casualties, but for generational suffering. The bacteria could remain in the soil for months, creating contaminated zones where the disease would resurface years after deployment, leaving survivors wondering why their children kept developing the same mysterious illness that killed their grandparents during the war. These village-scale field tests claimed an estimated 200,000 lives, each death meticulously categorized as successful pathogen deployment in research reports that American officials would later classify rather than prosecute. Typhoid fever experiments. Feeling uncomfortable yet? Good. We're just getting started on our descent. The scientists at Unit 731 weren't content with just studying typhoid fever. How pedestrian. No. They wanted to see it in all its glory. Spreading through unsuspecting Chinese villages, these lab coat-wearing sociopaths cultivated typhoid bacteria with the loving attention most people reserve for orchids or vintage wines. They'd contaminate local wells and food supplies with their typhoid cocktails, then set up observation posts nearby, like wildlife photographers, except the wildlife was human suffering, and the photography was detailed clinical notes on how quickly children's bodies would succumb to raging fevers of 104 degrees Fahrenheit and higher. Little Ming, age 6, her tiny body provided excellent data on how typhoid's signature rose spots develop on the chest and abdomen. The scientists noted with clinical fascination how her delirious crying for her mother gradually weakened as her intestines perforated. A common typhoid complication where your gut literally bursts open from the inside. In one particularly innovative experiment at Nanjing, researchers distributed typhoid-laced snacks to hungry civilians. The researchers actually threw themselves a little celebration when the paratyphoid strain proved most effective at decimating the local population. The most efficient delivery system? Turns out contaminated melons were perfect typhoid taxis. The bacteria thrived in the sweet flesh, and who could resist a fresh slice on a hot day? Certainly not the prisoners whose agonizing deaths were meticulously timed and documented. And here's the kicker. The American military granted these scientists immunity in exchange for their research data, because nothing says justice like letting mass murderers walk free if their PowerPoint presentations are compelling enough. Isn't human history just the best? Development of poison bullets. But why stop a disease when you can make your standard weapons even more horrifying? Why settle for mere lead penetration when you could also deliver a delightful cocktail of toxins directly into your enemy's bloodstream? These scientific overachievers weren't content with standard ammunition. They developed specialized bullets laced with an assortment of biological and chemical agents that would make any toxicologist weak at the knees. The poison bullet program began in earnest around 1940, when researchers realized that bullets could serve as excellent delivery vehicles for their growing collection of pathogens. They experimented with hollow point ammunition, bullets with tiny cavities in the tip that could be filled with everything, from tetanus spores to botulinum toxin, which is the world's deadliest poison. A single gram of this could kill over 1 million people, which means Unit 731 didn't exactly need a lot of it to kill just one person. One particularly charming variation contained bacterial cultures of gas gangrene, an infection that literally causes your muscle tissue to bubble and rot while you're still alive. Imagine being a Chinese farmer, shot by a Japanese soldier, thinking, well, at least it's just a flesh wound, only to watch your limb turn black and start fizzing like an abandoned soda can within days. The researchers, as usual, took special interest in how children's smaller bodies responded to these poison bullets. Their higher metabolic rates meant the toxins spread more quickly, providing more efficient data collection. The tetanus-laced bullets were particular favorites among the research team. Tetanus causes all your muscles to contract simultaneously, eventually turning your body into one giant painful cramp until your respiratory muscles seize and you suffocate. The Unit 731 scientists meticulously documented how long it took for the jaw muscles to lock, hence tetanus' charming nickname, lockjaw, after bullet wounds of varying depths and locations. In one experiment, they lined up 30 prisoners, including several women carrying infants, and shot them in various body parts to compare infection rates and symptom progression. The mothers' desperate attempts to comfort their dying children while succumbing to tetanus themselves were noted as interesting peripheral observations in the research documents. The most innovative bullets contained a combination of anthrax spores and small vials of hydrogen cyanide that would shatter upon impact, creating a delightful 1-2 punch of infection and immediate chemical poisoning. These were tested on families captured from villages near Harbin. The parents shot first so researchers could observe the psychological effects on children watching their parents die before receiving their own special delivery. When American forces discovered this research, they thought, this is horrible. Also, can we have a copy? Tier 4. More advanced human testing. Expert testimony. Before we plunge deeper into the darkest levels of this iceberg, let's hear from someone who witnessed it firsthand. Because sometimes the most chilling perspective comes from those who were complicit. Nakagawa Yonezo, an absolutely charming professor emeritus from Osaka University who got his education at Kyoto, had the unique entertainment opportunity of watching Unit 731's greatest hits. Basically, snuff films disguised as science documentaries. In his testimony about the research, he expressed what can only be described as childlike glee. Like, seriously, what possible medical insights were gained by meticulously filming decapitations from multiple camera angles? Absolutely none. That was just grown men with medical degrees enjoying their playtime. Because here's the dirty little secret about professionals with fancy credentials. They enjoy recreational cruelty just as much as any common psychopath. They just get government funding for it. Nothing quite like hearing a respected professor casually confirm that his colleagues were essentially playing twisted games with human lives between faculty meetings. And the scariest part, we're just getting started with the truly disturbing stuff. Forced pregnancy and fetal experimentation. As we descend to the next level of this nightmare, things get even darker. Prepare yourselves. Unit 731 has its own warped version of a maternity ward, where family planning meant forcibly impregnating women to create tiny research specimens. Our dedicated researchers weren't content with experimenting on adults. They wanted fresh, developing humans to play with. So they systematically raped female prisoners or forced male and female captives to have under observation. The doctors created detailed developmental charts as pregnancies progressed, regularly drawing blood and amniotic fluid. That's the liquid surrounding the fetus. Basically, baby's first swimming pool, from these unwilling mothers. They were particularly interested in how various diseases cross the placental barrier, that magic membrane separating mom's blood from the baby's. When these pregnancies reached interesting stages, some women were strapped to tables for cesarean sections without anesthesia. Scientists observed how long both mother and baby could survive this simultaneous trauma. Staff placed bets on survival times, with winners receiving extra sake rations. One survivor recalled a heavily pregnant woman being dissected alive. Her belly was cut open and a baby was taken out. The mother was screaming, "It hurts, it hurts," until she died. The researchers then turned to experimenting on the infant, a 2-for-1 special in their twisted research program. Some babies were actually delivered normally, only to be infected with various pathogens to study fresh immune responses. Others became practice subjects for surgical techniques. Tiny bodies opened and rearranged by researchers learning their craft. Remember, these weren't just test subjects. They were women who had dreams, families, and futures before becoming breeding stock for Japan's scientific elite. Their babies weren't just specimens, they were human beings who experienced their first and last breaths in the same laboratory. Science marches on, stepping over small corpses along the way. Injecting air into subjects' bloodstreams. Looking for a clean, efficient way to kill someone that leaves minimal evidence? Unit 731 had you covered. Let's dive deeper into their catalog of horrors. Did you know that air bubbles in your bloodstream can kill you more efficiently than many poisons? The creative minds at Unit 731 certainly did, and they turned this medical emergency into an art form. Welcome to Embolism 101, where Japanese researchers systematically injected carefully measured amounts of air directly into prisoners' veins to determine the exact quantity needed for death. An air embolism, essentially a bubble traveling through your bloodstream, can block blood vessels like a cork in a bottle, causing tissues to die from oxygen deprivation. It's like an invisible bullet traveling through your circulatory system. Dr. Hirosato Yoshimura, who later became a respected professor at Kyoto University, meticulously documented the precise volume required to kill people of different weights, ages, and health conditions. His research showed that injecting about 20 cc of air would cause cardiac arrest in most adults, roughly the amount in a small syringe. For context, that's less air than in a shot glass, yet enough to stop your heart. They designed custom syringes with precise volumetric markings to inject varying amounts of air into different access points. Femoral vein injections, those are the big blood vessels in your groin, took longer to cause death than those administered directly into the jugular. Scientists timed the progression with stopwatches, noting how subjects' lips turned blue, their bodies convulsed, and their eyes bulged as air bubbles reached critical organs. One particularly memorable experiment involved a young mother and her toddler, injected simultaneously so researchers could compare the differing rates at which their organs failed. The child died within 3 minutes. The mother lived for 7, conscious enough to watch her baby die before succumbing herself. Sleep tight next time you're hooked up to an IV. Blood loss experiments to determine survival thresholds. How much blood can a human lose before dying? Most medical textbooks offer estimates, but Unit 731 wanted exact measurements, down to the last drop. First, they sorted prisoners by weight, age, and health. Because if you're going to drain someone dry, you might as well be scientific about it. Their methodology was simple but effective. Strap victims down, insert cannulas, those fancy medical tubes, into major blood vessels, and drain them at controlled rates while monitoring vital signs. Most people blacked out after losing 40% of their blood, about 2 liters. Death usually followed at 50 to 55%, unless you were lucky enough to pass out first. Unit 731 also noted slight differences in survival rates. Northern Chinese prisoners lasted marginally longer than those from southern regions, attributed to adaptation to colder climates. But why stop at just draining blood when you could also experiment with replacements? One unlucky prisoner got a transfusion of sheep's blood. His body immediately rejected it, twisting in agony as his immune system freaked out and tried to kill him before the experimenters could. Horse blood worked slightly better. Still killed you though, just took a little longer. Some experiments forced children to watch their parents slowly exsanguinate, while researchers measured how emotional distress affected heart rate and blood pressure. It did. Watching a loved one die accelerated the process. The blood they drained didn't always go to waste. Some of it was used for transfusions in wounded Japanese soldiers. Imagine being the guy who just timed how long it took a teenage girl to die, then turning around and using her blood to save a pilot. Efficiency. This research directly informed modern trauma protocols for blood loss treatment. Hypothermia Research. Feeling chilly? Count your blessings you were in part of Unit 731's winter wonderland of hypothermia experiments. As we descend into the darker levels of our iceberg, the experiments become even more unimaginable. While most researchers would use lab animals to study cold's effects on living tissue, the pragmatists at Unit 731 skip right to human trials. Remember all those families they marched naked into Manchuria's negative 40-degree Fahrenheit winter weather and doused with ice water? Well, apparently it only led to more curiosity. Dr. Yoshimura, our air embolism enthusiast from earlier, discovered something. Children's limbs froze significantly faster than adults, but their core temperatures dropped more slowly. Why? Higher metabolic rates and different body fat distribution. This led to the charming observation that children remained conscious longer while watching their own fingers turn black with frostbite. In indoor experiments, researchers submerged prisoners in ice baths while monitoring internal organ temperatures with rectal thermometers. They discovered that most subjects lost consciousness at a core temperature of 86 degrees Fahrenheit and died at around 77 degrees Fahrenheit, unless they were pregnant women who somehow maintained consciousness almost 2 degrees lower. One researcher noted this was likely an evolutionary protection mechanism for offspring. The most valuable findings came from rewarming studies. When a frostbitten limb is rapidly rewarmed, the resulting tissue damage is catastrophic. Researchers documented this by thawing frozen arms in water of progressively increasing temperatures, then peeling back skin layers to observe blood vessel damage. One particularly detailed case study involved an elderly man and his grandson, who were frozen together and then rewarmed at different rates. The notes described how the child cried for his grandfather despite his own suffering, filed under ancillary psychological observations. Contemporary cold weather survival protocols and frostbite treatments derive directly from this research. Poisonous gas exposure. Chemical warfare, making conventional bombs seem downright neighborly since 1915. Unit 731 wasn't about to let the Europeans dominate the poison gas market, so they established their own boutique gas chamber operation. These weren't your standard execution chambers. They were observation theaters with glass walls, where researchers could comfortably watch subjects experience the latest in chemical warfare technology. The facility featured specialized chambers for testing different gases: mustard gas, Lewisite, phosgene, and the unit's personal favorite, hydrogen cyanide. Each chamber was designed with ventilation controls to deliver precise concentrations, while cameras recorded the victims' reactions for later study. Mustard gas experiments were particularly comprehensive. Researchers exposed subjects to varying concentrations, documenting how the oily liquid formed blisters on skin within hours. These blisters would then rupture, leaving raw, open wounds susceptible to infection. When mustard gas was inhaled, it created similar blisters in the lungs, essentially drowning victims in their own fluids. Scientists found that children's thinner skin blistered more quickly, while their smaller airways became obstructed faster, making them ideal indicators for gas concentration effectiveness. In one documented case, researchers placed a mother and 3 children in a chamber with a gradual release of mustard gas. The youngest child, a toddler, showed symptoms first: coughing, eye irritation, then respiratory distress. The mother, despite her own suffering, tried to cover her children's faces with her clothing. Researchers noted this as instinctive but ineffective protective behavior and continued their observations until all 4 had succumbed. The most methodical experiments include comparative gas studies. Groups of prisoners would be exposed to different chemical agents simultaneously, allowing scientists to rank their effectiveness. Hydrogen cyanide proved fastest, death in 2 to 3 minutes, while phosgene was slowest but produced the most visible respiratory distress, a clinical way of saying victims spent longer consciously suffocating as their lungs filled with fluid. These findings directly informed Japanese gas mask design and antidote development, though primarily for protecting their own troops rather than treating victims. Some of these antidote formulations still influence modern chemical exposure treatments. Remember, when someone mentions the Geneva Protocol banning chemical weapons, it wasn't written because someone thought it might be a problem someday. It was written because of nightmares like these. Electrocution Experiments. Shocking news from Unit 731. Turns out, electricity in human bodies mix exactly as poorly as you'd expect. As we approach the bottom of our iceberg, the experiments become increasingly sadistic. While Thomas Edison was infamously electrocuting elephants to demonstrate the dangers of alternating current, Unit 731 scientists were systematically exploring every possible way to kill humans with electricity. These weren't just casual zaps. They were methodically designed experiments to determine exact voltages, amperages, and durations needed for maximum damage. Researchers constructed specialized apparatus featuring adjustable voltage controls, electrode attachments for different body parts, and timing mechanisms to deliver precise electrical pulses. Victims were strapped to wooden chairs. Wood doesn't conduct electricity, convenient for operators, with copper electrodes attached to various body locations. The most common configuration placed electrodes on the temples, genitals, and major joints, all areas with high nerve concentration for maximum pain. One particularly thorough experiment involved testing different current pathways through the body. Researchers discovered that electricity traveling across the chest was most likely to cause cardiac arrhythmia, irregular heartbeats that can lead to sudden death. A current of just 100 milliamps, that's roughly the amount used by a small light bulb passing through the heart for 2 seconds, proved sufficient to cause ventricular fibrillation, a condition where your heart quivers uselessly instead of pumping. Scientists kept meticulous records of how different voltages affected various demographic groups. Elderly subjects typically succumbed to cardiac arrest more quickly, while younger prisoners often endured longer sessions before heart failure. Women generally showed higher resistance to electrical current than men, a finding that surprised researchers enough to warrant its own supplementary study involving 20 female prisoners of varying ages. The psychological component wasn't overlooked either. Researchers would often electrocute one family member while others watched, noting how witnessing a loved one's suffering affected subsequent electrical resistance when their turn came. One notebook entry coldly observed, Subject 34F exhibited significantly lower resistance after watching her daughter's electrocution, 17% decrease in survival time at identical voltage. Perhaps most disturbing was the development of recoverable protocols, electrical exposures designed to cause maximum pain without killing the subject, allowing for repeated experiments on the same person. These techniques directly influenced later torture methods used by military intelligence services worldwide. The data collected has contributed to modern electrical safety standards and medical treatments for electrical injuries. Testing pain thresholds. We've now reached the bottom of our iceberg, the darkest experiments that barely see the light of historical documentation. How much pain can a human endure before losing consciousness, before dying, before begging for death? Unit 731 has spreadsheets for all these thresholds. Pain research at Unit 731 elevated suffering to a science, with methodical exploration of every conceivable way to hurt a human being while measuring their responses. These weren't just sadistic torture sessions. They were carefully controlled experiments with control groups, consistent methodology, and published results. Pain quantified and categorized like butterfly specimens. Researchers developed a standardized pain scale, precursor to the 1 to 10 scale your doctor uses, based on observable physiological responses, pupil dilation, heart rate, blood pressure spikes, and involuntary muscle contractions. Then they set about finding exactly what level of stimulus corresponded to each point on their scale. The experiments were diverse and methodical. Thermal pain tests involved applying heated metal to skin at precise temperatures and durations. Pressure pain assessments used calibrated devices to crush fingers, toes, and limbs with increasing force. Chemical irritant studies applied acids, bases, and organic compounds to mucous membranes while measuring response intensity. Their findings were sometimes surprising. Women generally demonstrated higher pain tolerance than men, particularly mothers who had experienced childbirth. Elderly subjects showed diminished pain responses due to reduced nerve sensitivity, while children exhibited the most intense reactions. Researchers noted that psychological factors significantly influenced pain perception. Subjects who were allowed to see the pain-inducing apparatus beforehand showed higher stress responses than those who were blindfolded. One particularly comprehensive study involved identical painful stimuli applied to different ethnic groups to test the hypothesis that race influenced pain tolerance. The results debunked this racist assumption, showing that individual variation within groups exceeded any differences between populations, a conclusion that mysteriously disappeared from the final report. In an especially cruel series of experiments, researchers tested comparative pain thresholds between family members, forcing parents to watch their children subjected to identical painful stimuli they had just experienced. One researcher noted, Subject 127M exhibited greater physiological distress watching his son undergo fingernail removal than during his own procedure, suggesting psychological pain may exceed physical tolerance limits. These findings were later incorporated into interrogation manuals used by various intelligence agencies, with the psychological aspects proving particularly useful in developing enhanced interrogation techniques. The pain threshold data also contributed to the development of analgesic medications and surgical protocols, something to ponder while popping your next headache pill. Observing psychological breakdown. Why torture just the body when you can shatter the mind too? At the very bottom of our iceberg lies perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Unit 731's work, the deliberate destruction of the human psyche. While other departments focused on boring old biological death, the psychological research team specialized in destroying personalities while keeping bodies technically alive. Their methodology? Systematic application of trauma, deprivation, and psychological manipulation designed to break even the strongest minds. Researchers constructed specialized observation rooms where prisoners could be monitored continuously while subjected to varied psychological stressors. Two-way mirrors allowed scientists to observe without being seen, creating an environment of constant surveillance that subjects couldn't escape, even in their minds. The experiments followed several distinct protocols. In isolation studies, prisoners were kept in complete sensory deprivation. Soundproof cells with no light, minimal space, and irregular feeding schedules that destroyed their sense of time. Researchers documented the progression from anxiety to hallucinations to complete psychotic breaks, finding that most subjects began experiencing severe hallucinations after just 72 hours. Another protocol focused on induced paranoia. Multiple prisoners were housed together, but with artificial scenarios created to foster distrust. Researchers would secretly provide one prisoner with extra food, leading others to suspect collaboration with guards. They planted false evidence of betrayal and rewarded prisoners for reporting on others. One particularly effective technique involved staged whispered conversations just audible enough for prisoners to hear fragments suggesting one of their group was actually a Japanese agent. Researchers documented the complete psychological collapse of previously stable individuals. Former teachers, farmers, and laborers reduced to incoherent, hallucinating shells within weeks. They discovered that mothers with children present showed extraordinary psychological resilience until separated from their children, after which they deteriorated more rapidly than any other demographic. Perhaps most disturbing were the breaking point studies, designed to identify exactly when and how human solidarity fractured under pressure. By gradually increasing threats and incentives, researchers mapped the precise conditions under which humans would betray family members. One log entry coldly noted, Subject 89F provided accurate information about husband's resistance activities after 17 days of conditioning. psychological pivot point appeared to be the recorded sounds of what she believed was her daughter crying. And oh yeah, speaking of families, remember all those instances where people had to watch their loved ones split open and dissected, watching them get blown to pieces, watching their skulls pop open? This is where all the data collected from earlier experiments came in handy. These findings directly influenced modern psychological warfare techniques, interrogation methods, and, ironically, therapeutic approaches to trauma recovery. The next time you hear about resilience training for soldiers or emergency responders, know that some of those insights came from watching people's minds systematically destroyed. Sweet dreams. Tier 5. Extreme tortures. Removal of stomach without anesthetic. April 15, 1942. Dr. Tanaka opens his personal journal and jots down his latest entry. Performed my 9th gastric excision today. Still can't get subject number 3476 out of my head. Young mother, maybe 28. Hard to tell with the malnourishment. Kept staring at the surgical team with these unnervingly calm eyes while we peeled back her abdominal wall. No screaming like the others. Just quiet tears tracking down her temples into her hair. The procedures become quite routine now. Vertical incision from xiphoid process to umbilicus. Clamp abdominal wall retractors, sever gastric arteries, ligate esophageal junction, detach duodenum, remove stomach. Simple recipe really. But here's what still fascinates me. That moment when you lift the stomach out of the body cavity while the patient watches. Our little gastric surprise party, as Dr. Yamamoto calls it. I've started holding it up like a trophy fish so they can get a good look. Sometimes I narrate, this is what's been digesting your rice all these years. Wave goodbye. Today's subject lasted 3 hours, 17 minutes post-extraction. That's a new record. Dr. Ishii thinks it might be because we left the greater omentum partially intact. We're placing bets on tomorrow's duration. The strangest part, once we severed the vagus nerves, those are the communication highways between the brain and stomach, her hunger pangs actually increased. She kept moaning about being starving, even as we were literally removing the organ it experiences hunger. The brain is delightfully stubborn about its phantom sensations. When she finally stopped breathing, little nurse Sato actually looked disappointed. She'd put 500 yen on the subject lasting past dinner. She'll need to develop a stronger clinical detachment if she wants to make it here. Tomorrow, we're testing different closure techniques on the esophageal stump. My money's on the purse string method, though Dr. Hayashi insists his double-layer approach will yield longer survival times. I think I'll have sukiyaki for dinner. I've worked up quite an appetite. He closes his personal journal, gets up from his chair to go sit on one next to the dining table, where his wife places a freshly cooked sukiyaki for him and their children to enjoy. And the next day, Dr. Tanaka does this all over again. Because in the darkest depths of human history, the most terrifying realization isn't just that monsters exist, it's that they go home to dinner with their families after a day of unspeakable cruelty and sleep soundly before doing it all again. Attaching limbs to opposite sides of the body. Behold, man's first successful arm transplant, Dr. Fujita announced gleefully to his colleagues gathered around operating table C. Picture this. A middle-aged farmer staring in silent horror at his new body. His left arm now grotesquely attached to his right side, while some other poor soul across the room got his original right arm. Notice how we've aligned the brachial artery with perfect approximation, Fujita continued, using a wooden pointer like some twisted tour guide. Nerve reattachment is still experimental, but blood flow has been established. This wasn't some mad scientist fever dream. This was just Tuesday at Unit 731's surgical playground. Dr. Fujita pioneered what he elegantly called topographic surgical reorientation, because scrambling humans like Lego sets wouldn't look as good on the research ground. The operating theater became Fujita's personal sandbox for anatomical mixing. Arms on hips, legs on shoulders, hands directly on torsos. Why follow the boring human blueprint when you could just improvise? These weren't replacement for damaged limbs. These were perfectly healthy appendages, chopped off and reattached elsewhere just to see what would happen. Innovation. In his research proposal, Fujita wrote, "The military applications are self-evident. Soldiers with combat-damaged limbs could receive transplants in unconventional positions rather than being discharged as invalids. Never mind that his subjects didn't have damaged limbs to begin with. Details. Our farmer friend on table C survived 9 days, developing a massive infection despite aggressive antibiotics. During those 9 days, Fujita's team tried to retrain his nervous system through electrical stimulations that just made the limb spasm while the guy screamed. Science. In Fujita's notes, one detail stands out. Subject repeatedly attempts to scratch itches on his original left side with his transplanted left arm, now located on his right. The deeply ingrained body map persists despite physical restructuring. Fascinating, right? The brain remembers what the body forgets. When the farmer finally died of sepsis, Fujita was already prepping his next innovation: cross-subject transplantation of facial features. After all, in his words, the face is just another appendage waiting to be relocated. Collection of live organs. You know how cooking shows always talk about fresh ingredients? Well, Unit 731 took that concept to a whole new level of hell. These Japanese doctors weren't just satisfied with regular autopsies, no. They needed to see organs while they were still doing their little organ things. The real kicker? They call this practice surgery. Like, imagine being a med student and your professor goes, "Today we'll be removing Mr. Chen's pancreas without anesthesia," while timing how long he stays conscious. And everyone just takes notes. The academic term for this is vivisection, literally cutting the living, but that clinical language really sanitizes what was happening. Butchery, with a clipboard and a stopwatch. But wait, it gets worse. One particularly stomach-turning experiment involved comparing circulatory systems of different family members. They'd slice open a father and son side by side, noting how a child's smaller heart pumped faster, while the father's eyes remained fixed on his suffering child. Data point: parental distress exceeds personal pain thresholds. Did you know they kept detailed notes on how many hammer blows it took to damage different organs beyond repair? 3 precisely measured impacts for a child's spleen. 5 for an adult male. Someone got a promotion for that finding. Probably celebrated with sake while their test subjects bled out in the trash bins. The researchers had a weird obsession with the pancreas, that little glandular organ behind your stomach that regulates insulin. They discovered that removing it led to rapid onset diabetes-like symptoms, with sugar levels reaching fatal heights within hours. Today's diabetic monitoring systems evolved partly from watching how quickly prisoners died without this crucial organ. That's not in Dexcom marketing materials, is it? Testing bacterial infections in open wounds. Hey, you ever wondered what happens when you pour raw sewage into a fresh knife wound? No? Well, Unit 731 researchers were absolutely dying to know. And by dying, I mean making other people die. Slowly. For science. These weren't just sloppy infections either, this was bacterial mixology at its finest. They'd slice open arms, legs, torsos, dealer's choice really, and then introduce various bacterial cocktails with surgical precision. We're talking about cultures of Clostridium perfringens, that's gas gangrene to you and me, Streptococcus, and other microscopic nightmares that turn flesh into a science fair volcano of pus and decay. They'd carefully measure exact quantities of bacterial slurry, like evil bartenders mixing death cocktails, to determine minimum infectious doses. The most disturbingly practical discovery? That maggots really do clean infected wounds effectively. Prisoners with fly larvae squirming in their festering flesh wounds actually survived longer than those without nature's little garbage disposals. This finding actually made it into legitimate medical journals, minus the inconvenient backstory of how the data was collected. Forced ingestion of disease-carrying animals. Just when you thought forced infections couldn't get more creative, Unit 731 said hold my sake and introduced an entire buffet of biological horror. So today's menu special is rat smoothie with a side of plague. Researchers would joke as they force-fed prisoners live disease vectors. Not content with merely injecting pathogens, these culinary sadists develop whole new ways to introduce diseases into the human body. Prisoners had their mouths pried open with metal clamps, while researchers dumped in live carriers of disease. Rats infected with plague, cockroaches carrying typhoid, and even parasitic worms cultivated in laboratory conditions. Children were often selected for these tests because their smaller bodies meant quicker disease progression, or, as one researcher noted with chilling efficiency, more efficient use of biological materials. The scientists discovered that forced ingestion of intestinal parasites like Ascaris, or giant roundworms growing up to 14 inches long, created particularly prolonged suffering. They meticulously documented how these worms would migrate through intestinal walls, sometimes reaching the lungs or brain. One female prisoner survived 3 weeks with roundworms gradually consuming her from within, her distended abdomen sketched in clinical detail as the parasites multiplied. Most disturbing was the comparative testing, feeding identical disease carriers to family members of different ages to create progression charts. Entire families watched each other succumb to the same parasites at different rates, with researchers betting cigarettes on which family member would die last. Tier 6. The most depraved cases. Recording time until death. They weren't just killing people, they were creating mortality spreadsheets. Excel before Excel existed. They discovered that blood loss death followed predictable patterns. Adults typically lost consciousness after losing 40% blood volume and died after 55 to 60%, while children reached these thresholds significantly faster. Pregnancy accelerated the process further, with third trimester women sometimes succumbing after just 35% blood loss, a finding later incorporated into combat medical protocols. Yeah, that's right, some of this data is still used today. Sleep tight. The timing of organ failure created particularly detailed records. Researchers removed organs one by one, timing how long subjects remained conscious without each. The results? You can survive about 3 minutes without a liver before losing consciousness. Kidneys? About 40 minutes before toxins build up enough to cause seizures. Intestines? Surprisingly long. Some subjects remained alert for hours. File that away for your next trivia night. Flamethrowers tested on bound subjects. Just when you thought we'd reached peak horror, Unit 731 decided regular killing wasn't enough. They needed to add fire. Because why not? How many seconds does it take human skin to bubble and pop under direct flame? Wasn't a question normal people ask, but Unit 731 researchers not only asked about it, they created detailed charts with the answers. A literal trial by fire. In what they clinically termed thermal efficiency studies, prisoners were secured to wooden posts at varying distances from flamethrower operators. The Weapons Testing Division meticulously documented burn patterns, recording how different fuels, pressures, and nozzle configurations affected human tissue. Subjects, soon to experience literal hellfire, were arranged in rows, creating human gradient charts of burn severity. The researchers discovered that napalm-like mixtures containing phosphorus created particularly severe burns that continued to penetrate tissue after initial exposure. Children with thinner skin and higher body water content developed third-degree burns approximately 40% faster than adults. These findings directly informed the development of improved incendiary weapons later used against civilian populations. Forced infections of prisoners with STDs. As if literally barbecuing prisoners alive wasn't enough, Unit 731 even had an STD research division, which, as you might have guessed, did not study people already infected with STDs. Oh no, that would be too humane. Unlike the somewhat random disease experiments elsewhere in the facility, the STD program had a specific military application. Japanese officers were regularly contracting syphilis, gonorrhea, and other infections from comfort women in brothels. Rather than promoting safe sex practices, revolutionary concept, the Imperial Command wanted treatment options that would allow their troops to continue without consequences. And that's where Unit 731 saw their new research opportunity. All they had to do now was acquire test subjects, and instead of studying the soldiers already infected with STDs, they had them prisoners to do so. Researchers methodically tracked disease progression across different demographics. Young girls, not yet sexually mature, showed dramatically different symptom patterns than adult women when infected with the same dosage of Syphilis spirochetes, the corkscrew-shaped bacteria that caused the disease. Male subjects developed painful urethral cankers within days of forced infection, meticulously photographed in progression series for medical text. Perhaps most disturbing was the transgenerational tracking. Pregnant women were infected at different trimesters to document how syphilis crossed the placental barrier. Researchers discovered that third trimester infections sometimes allowed babies to be born apparently healthy before developing symptoms months later. Information later used to identify congenital syphilis cases in civilian populations. Systematic breeding program for test subjects. Following the STD experiments, Unit 731 faced a shortage of test subjects. Because, they kept dying for some reason. While most research facilities had to make do with whatever test subjects were shipped their way, the forward-thinking Dr. Ishii recognized a fundamental truth. Why hunt for specimens when you can grow your own? They saw the womb as the perfect laboratory to cook up new test subjects and wanted to improve upon its efficiency. Improvement meant selection of women with specific genetic traits, done by the Genetic Material Acquisition Specialists. Fancy title for immune resilience, physical stamina, or particular blood types, and pairing them with male subjects carrying complementary characteristics. Women who resisted were, of course, forced. Children born into this nightmare were cataloged like livestock, assigned numbers rather than names, and raised in gray, dark, concrete nurseries where their development was documented with cold efficiency. Staff referred to these facilities as seed beds, sterilized environments where the next generation of test subjects grew under careful observation. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the forced breeding itself, but the deliberate exposure of pregnant women to pathogens. The earlier STD researches resulted in some fascinating discoveries. Researchers discovered that many bacteria wouldn't cross the placental barrier, while others passed through easily. Subject F217 delivered, surviving infant after third trimester plague exposure, reads one clinical note. Child shows unusual resistance. Scheduled dissection for tomorrow to examine antibody concentration in liver tissue. Brain transplant experiments. You know how sometimes you wake up with a headache and think, man, I wish I had a new brain? Well, Unit 731 took that concept way too literally. Not content with merely watching gray matter function during vivisection, they began exploring what would happen when you start playing musical chairs with cerebral tissue. Brain transplants. What could go wrong? The brain transplantation experiments began after researchers noticed something peculiar during routine vivisections. Brain tissue remained active for minutes after removal. This sparked a grotesque curiosity. Could portions of brain survive if transplanted to another host? Could memories or skills transfer? Prisoner number 45, a math teacher from Harbin, became their first high-profile test case. Portions of his cerebellum, that's the part of your brain that handles coordination and balance, were extracted while he remained conscious. Children as young as 4 were prize subjects because their developing brains had what researchers called exceptional plasticity. That's science speak for their brains adapt better. One researcher noted that when removing portions of frontal lobe from a 6-year-old girl, she continued to hum a lullaby her mother had taught her until the specific memory centers were damaged. The observation was logged with a clinical detachment of someone commenting on a mildly interesting weather pattern. Deliberate conjoined twin experiments. If you thought Human Centipede was just a disturbing movie concept, Unit 731 would like to introduce you to their artificial twin program, where they gave getting close to someone a whole new, horrifying meaning. While nature occasionally produces conjoined twins, Unit 731 wondered why wait for nature when they could create their own pairs. Medical science at its most perverse. Taking perfectly normal, separate humans and seeing what happens when you surgically stitch them together. Because if there's anything history has taught us, it's that playing God always ends well. The procedure typically involved selecting 2 compatible prisoners. Blood typing was essential, because what's the point of sewing people together if they're just going to reject each other immediately? Once selected, subjects would be partially sedated. Not enough to render them unconscious, that would ruin the data on pain responses. Just enough to prevent immediate struggle. Matching incisions would be made along torsos, limbs, or backs, depending on the attachment configuration being studied. The researchers focused on creating 3 primary connections: circulatory or shared blood vessels, digestive, connected intestinal tracts, and in the most extreme cases, attempting partial nervous system links. Success rates were pretty abysmal. Most subjects died within days from infection, cross-circulation shock, or simply the overwhelming trauma. But that was data too. Meticulously recorded death progression charts filled countless notebooks. Children, as usual, were particularly prized subjects for these experiments. Their smaller bodies made surgical linking easier, and their heightened resilience meant longer observation periods. Tier 7. Discovery and Aftermath. Discovery of human remains in 1989 construction. Ever wonder what happens when you dig up the wrong patch of dirt in Tokyo? In 1989, construction workers in Shinjuku weren't expecting their excavator to unearth the dirty little secret Japan had been hiding for decades. Human bones. And not just any bones. Ones with modifications that would make Frankenstein's monster look like amateur hour. As they dug deeper, reality became more nightmarish. A mass grave containing over 100 individuals. These weren't typical remains, though. They were humanity's first guinea pigs. Skulls with perfect drill holes, bones with surgical cutting marks. One skeleton had 6 metal rods embedded in its leg bones, inserted while the person was alive, as bone growth had formed around them like the body's desperate attempt to normalize the abnormal. A child's skeleton, just 8 years old, had its ribcage surgically altered and reinforced with wire. What kind of medical research requires rewiring a child's chest? This wasn't some random burial ground. The site had previously hosted a medical school with documented connections to Unit 731. Records showed researchers had transferred there in 1942 to establish what they euphemistically called a domestic research continuation program. Because why stop torturing people just because the war is going badly? Most disturbing were the vivisection markers, cut marks on the inside of rib cages, spinal columns severed while victims were alive, shown by bone healing patterns, and skulls with precision-cut sections removed from multiple angles. One adult female skeleton showed evidence of having her limbs surgically reattached in incorrect positions before death. Someone had turned her into a human puzzle, rearranged the pieces, and watched what happened. Japan's official response: legitimate medical specimens from normal research activities. When pressed about why legitimate specimens would be secretly buried rather than properly cremated, they pivoted to emergency disposal during wartime conditions. How convenient that emergencies always seem to happen right when your crimes need hiding. The most chilling part wasn't what they found. It was how quickly Japan poured concrete over it. No memorial, no investigation. Just a foundation built atop forgotten suffering. Workers were instructed to keep quiet, while government officials photographed the remains before confiscation. History being erased in real time. Only one worker, Tanaka Shigeru, ever spoke publicly about what he saw. Some bones had numbers carved into them, like inventory tags. I still dream about the small ones, the children's bones. They were stacked separately, neater than the others, almost carefully arranged. Someone took time with them. The remains were cremated in a private ceremony. No DNA analysis, no forensic investigation. Just ashes scattered over water. Japan's attempt to finally dissolve evidence that refused to stay buried. Discovery of mass graves in 2011. You think one mass grave is disturbing? In 2011, China's high-speed rail construction revealed something far worse. A mass grave containing approximately 400 individuals just 3 kilometers from Unit 731's former headquarters. But unlike Japan's pave and forget approach, China decided this time the dead would speak. Chinese authorities turned this into a proper archaeological excavation with forensic experts, historians, and media coverage that had Japanese diplomats reaching for their antacids. What emerged wasn't just evidence of war crimes, it was a catalog of methodical madness that makes modern horror films look like children's cartoons. Over 60% of remains showed precision surgical cutting marks on multiple bones. These weren't battlefield injuries or accidental trauma. These were the calculated incisions of researchers mapping the human body through destruction. Several skulls had neat circular holes drilled at specific points, corresponding with brain regions. One adult male skull had 13 such holes. Imagine someone systematically drilling into your brain while documenting which drill hole finally made you stop screaming. But what they did to the children, that's where this iceberg truly descends into darkness. Approximately 40 skeletons belong to children under 12, with several showing evidence of pressure experiments. Their small bones had distinctive compression fractures consistent with exposure to extreme atmospheric pressure, essentially crushed from the inside, as their bodies were subjected to conditions mimicking high altitude or deep sea environments. One child, estimated to be around 6 years old, showed evidence of having both arms subjected to freezing and thawing cycles multiple times before death. Someone had repeatedly frozen this child's arms until the tissue died, then thawed them to document the damage, over and over again until death mercifully intervened. And here's where it gets even darker. These remains still contained traces of chemical agents and diseases after 7 decades underground. Soil samples around certain remains tested positive for anthrax spores and heavy metal contaminants. Several adult remains showed unusually high concentrations of phosphorus in their bone tissue, consistent with exposure to chemical weapons. Unit 731's experiments didn't just end with death. They continued contaminating the Earth for generations. The evidence of restraint was everywhere. Many skeletons had wrists and ankles with groove marks worn into the bone itself, indicating victims had been restrained for so long that their struggles literally carved their captivity into their skeleton. Some spinal columns showed vertebrae fused in unnatural positions, suggesting victims had been confined in stress positions until their bones began physically adapting to their torture. Japan's response was diplomatic origami, folding words into shapes that acknowledged nothing while appearing remorseful. Official statements expressed regret for any suffering during the complicated historical period, without mentioning what caused that suffering or who did the suffering. When pressed about the evidence of medical experimentation, a spokesperson suggested the remains might represent conventional casualties of war. Yes, the kind of conventional casualties that just happen to have been systematically dissected with surgical precision. The excavation became a museum, one that Japan still suggests its citizens should probably not visit, because nothing ruins national pride quite like confronting what your grandparents did in the name of science. Destruction of facility evidence in 1945. When Japan realized in August 1945 that their 5-year plan for Asian domination was being cut dramatically short by 2 atomic wake-up calls, Unit 731 initiated what might be history's most comprehensive evidence-shredding party. Think of your most panicked browser history deletion, then multiply it by War Crimes Tribunal. The destruction wasn't chaotic panic. It was methodical erasure, executed with the same precision they'd applied to their experiments. Beginning August 9th, while Nagasaki was still glowing, Unit 731 staff implemented Emergency Protocol 7, their pre-planned evidence elimination program. They had always known this day might come, which tells you everything about how they viewed their own activities. First on their to-do list, eliminate the remaining logs, their dehumanizing term for human test subjects. Approximately 400 prisoners were still alive in the facility. By August 11th, none remained. Most were killed via lethal injection to preserve their bodies for final research, then cremated in the facility's incinerators. Staff worked in shifts to keep the furnaces running at full capacity for 72 hours straight. The resulting ash was mixed with coal dust and dumped into the Songhua River. Human evidence becoming one with the current while researchers meticulously documented their own crimes away. Next came the documents. Over 35 tons of research records, laboratory notes, photographs, and test results. The main administrative building had its own incinerator specifically designed for paper disposal, which operated continuously for 5 days. Some particularly valuable research findings were microfilmed first, with the films distributed among departing senior staff. Dr. Masashi Kitano, who took over Unit 731 leadership after Shirō Ishii, personally carried 3 waterproof containers of microfilm during his evacuation. Research deemed too valuable to destroy, but too incriminating to leave intact. They knew exactly what they had done, and exactly what it was worth. Physical evidence proved more challenging. Larger, specialized equipment couldn't be easily destroyed, so it was dismantled and repurposed or buried. The pressure chambers used for altitude experiments were disassembled and marked as industrial pressure vessels for shipment back to Japan. The Frostbite research facilities were burned after being doused with fuel. One staff member later testified that thermometers continued popping from the intense heat for hours, sounding like firecrackers as the building consumed itself. Even their instruments couldn't bear witness to what they had seen. Most disturbing was the destruction of the specimen storage. Thousands of body parts preserved in formaldehyde for ongoing research. Rather than attempt disposal, staff simply shattered the containers and set the entire laboratory wing on fire. The resulting chemical blaze was so intense it melted portions of the concrete floor. One Japanese soldier stationed outside described the smell as sweetly putrid, like burning sugar mixed with rotting meat. By August 15th, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, Unit 731 had largely vanished as a physical entity. When Soviet forces arrived days later, they found little beyond empty buildings, shell casings from executed prisoners, and bone fragments too small to be worth collecting. As one Russian officer noted, the Japanese have managed something almost impressive. They've made an atrocity disappear. Almost, but not quite. Because here's the thing about atrocities. They leave shadows. Even when you burn the body, something always remains. Even ashes tell stories if you know how to listen. Suppression of information in post-war Japan. After the war, Japan developed a relationship with its Unit 731 history that would make gaslighting narcissists take notes. It wasn't just denial. It was systematic erasure of memory on a national scale. The suppression began with the emperor himself. Hirohito, whose divine hands had approved the unit's funding for years, was being rebranded as America's favorite anti-communist ally. Can't have His Serene Highness associated with something as unseemly as systematic medical torture. Documents linking the imperial family to Unit 731 didn't just disappear. They vanished so completely you'd think they never existed. But paper trails, like bloodstains, have a way of reappearing under the right light. Japan's Ministry of Education performed what might be history's most impressive memory-holing operation, scrubbing textbooks clean of any meaningful reference to biological warfare or human experimentation. Japanese students learned about the unfortunate conflict in China without troublesome details like plague bombs or vivisection. One education official, when asked about this omission in 1982, explained it was to protect the psychological well-being of Japanese youth, because apparently learning actual history is more traumatic than creating generations ignorant of their nation's darkest chapter. Newspapers that attempted to publish accounts of Unit 731 found advertising revenue mysteriously evaporating. Television programs investigating the subject were rescheduled, then canceled, and forgotten entirely. When journalist Seiichi Morimura finally published The Devil's Gluttony in 1981, the first major Japanese expose on Unit 731, he received death threats and was denounced as anti-Japanese. Nothing says healthy national identity quite like threatening to kill people who tell uncomfortable truths. Academia became a fortress of selective amnesia. University departments that approved dissertations on Unit 731 found their funding under review. Professors who included the topic in lectures reported pressure from administrators to focus on less controversial subjects. Archives containing potentially relevant documents implemented new preservation policies that restricted access to materials over 50 years old, coincidentally making wartime records unavailable to researchers. Not destroyed, just permanently preserved behind locked doors. Former Unit 731 members operated under a code of silence, enforced not just by government pressure, but by shared complicity. They formed what they called friendship associations, mutual support networks that were less about reminiscing over old times, understandably, and more about ensuring nobody got chatty with historians. These groups tracked members' interactions with media and researchers, applying social pressure to maintain silence. Because nothing builds friendship quite like shared war crimes. Perhaps most revealing was the government's reaction when physical evidence emerged. When construction in Tokyo uncovered human remains linked to military experiments in 1989, officials quickly had them cremated, eliminating potential DNA evidence and classified all findings. The official report described them as unidentified war casualties. Japan's government finally acknowledged Unit 731's existence in 1993, nearly 50 years after the war, but still referred to its activities as defensive research conducted under complex historical circumstances. Even this minimal admission came only after Chinese researchers published irrefutable evidence from Soviet archives. The truth wasn't so much buried as placed in an administrative maze where it could wander forever, filing out paperwork that would never be processed. But here's the thing about burying evidence. Sometimes it grows into something you can't control. Location of unretrieved remains. What if I told you that right now, people are living, working, and raising families directly above evidence of history's most horrific medical crimes? Unit 731 didn't just kill people, it scattered their remains across Asia in a macabre constellation that continues to be discovered decades later. The most significant concentration lies beneath what is now a residential district of Harbin, China. Between apartment buildings and convenience stores, an estimated 300 to 600 bodies remain in unmarked pits. During construction in the 1980s, workers regularly discovered bone fragments, and in one particularly nightmarish moment, an entire preserved human head in a sealed glass jar, apparently overlooked during the facility's hasty evacuation. Construction typically continued after cursory investigation, meaning countless families now unknowingly prepare dinner above what amounts to crime scene evidence. Think about that. Approximately 7 kilometers northwest of the main facility lies what researchers have designated Disposal Area B, a remote forested area where victims of field testing were buried. Ground-penetrating radar has identified at least 11 mass graves, each estimated to contain 30 to 40 bodies. Chinese authorities have limited excavation, citing concerns about disturbing chemical and biological contaminants. One test dig in 1999 uncovered remains still showing traces of anthrax spores, apparently viable despite decades underground. The area remains fenced off, with warning signs citing environmental hazards. Unit 731's experiments haven't just killed their victims, they're still threatening the living 80 years later. Japan itself holds several suspected burial sites that the government has worked desperately to keep sealed. Construction at the former Tokyo Army Medical College in 2001 revealed a concrete chamber containing partial remains of approximately 65 individuals, many showing evidence of vivisection. The site was quickly sealed and construction plans modified to leave the area undisturbed, not as a memorial, but, according to internal documents, to avoid unnecessary historical complications. Japanese officials have consistently blocked efforts to conduct DNA testing on recovered remains, citing privacy concerns, apparently extending privacy rights to people they don't acknowledge existed. The islands of Micronesia contains perhaps the most forgotten victims. During Japan's occupation, Unit 731 conducted tropical adaptability tests on indigenous populations. Records suggest at least 27 mass grave sites across the region, primarily containing children used in vaccine experiments. Only 3 have been positively identified, as jungle growth and deliberate misdirection in Japanese records have hampered location efforts. These children died thousands of miles from home, their remains now lost in paradise. Most disturbing are the water disposals. Victims whose remains were deliberately cast into rivers, lakes, and the ocean. The Songhua River received thousands of cremated remains. However, Japanese records captured by Soviet forces indicate that during winter months, when the crematorium was operating beyond capacity, whole bodies were sometimes disposed of through holes cut in the river ice. Local fishermen occasionally reported catching unusual materials in their nets for decades after the war, including one incident in 1962 when a fisherman recovered a human skull with a precise circular hole drilled through the cranium. The river kept giving up secrets that Japan had hoped would stay submerged forever. These scattered remains aren't just historical artifacts, they're potential biohazards. Several sites show evidence of contamination with chemical agents and biological materials with alarming preservation qualities. As one Chinese researcher noted, we are not just dealing with historical evidence, but with active threats to public health. Unit 731's experiments continue to endanger lives decades after they were conducted. Each set of remains tells a story that both Japan and, to some extent, the United States have preferred remain untold, of suffering deliberately inflicted, data meticulously collected, and evidence imperfectly concealed. The dead are still speaking. The question is, who's listening? Documentation in Soviet archives. While America was busy cutting immunity deals with Unit 731's brightest minds, because apparently biological warfare expertise trumps crimes against humanity on the moral balance sheet, the Soviets took a different approach. They kept receipts, meticulously preserved testimony, captured documents, and physical evidence that would later blow holes in Japan's "we have no idea what you're talking about" defense strategy. The Soviet archives, finally opened to researchers after the USSR's collapse, contained over 3,500 documents specifically related to Unit 731. These weren't photocopies or translations, but original Japanese documents captured during the Soviet advance into Manchuria. Paperwork that Unit 731's hasty destruction efforts missed. It's like finding a serial killer's journal after they thought they'd burned it, complete with timestamps and favorite methods. The requisition forms are perhaps the most chilling in their banality. Mundane administrative documents that reveal the industrial scale of atrocity. One form, dated March 1942, requests delivery of 45 subjects for pressure testing, including 10 female subjects of childbearing age. It includes specifications for subject health requirements and a note that material may be consumed during testing. Bureaucratic euphemism for "we're going to kill these people." The form is countersigned by 4 different department heads and includes budget allocation codes. This wasn't mad scientists working in secret. This was institutional practice with accounting approval. Laboratory notebooks provide the technical soundtrack to the nightmare. One researcher, Dr. Yoshimura Hisato, maintained a 240-page notebook on frostbite experiments, meticulously documenting temperature exposure times, tissue damage progression, and subject survival rates. His notes include observations like Subject 11, female, approximately 19 years, exhibited unusual resistance to cold exposure, maintaining consciousness for 4 hours, 17 minutes in negative 40 degrees Celsius conditions. Recommended extended testing on female subjects to evaluate gender-based resilience factors. Imagine being so detached from humanity that you take notes while watching a teenage girl freeze for 4 hours. The archives contain approximately 2,400 photographs of documenting experiments, facility operations, and victim autopsies. One series shows the progression of plague systems in an 8-year-old boy over 6 days, with close-ups of developing buboes and tissue necrosis. The photo includes a smiling researcher pointing to particularly noteworthy symptoms, like a proud parent showing off a child's science project. Another sequence documents vivisection of a pregnant woman, with clinical shots of her exposed organs and the fetus still connected via umbilical cord. These weren't just crimes, they were carefully staged for the camera. Perhaps most significant are the transcripts of interrogations of captured Unit 731 personnel. Unlike the sanitized accounts many researchers later gave American authorities, these interrogations, conducted when Japan's defeat was fresh and before immunity deals were offered, contain remarkably candid admissions. One laboratory assistant described the screaming of vivisection subjects as so disruptive to concentration that we developed a protocol to sever vocal cords before major procedures. Another admitted they sometimes conducted experiments on subjects who had technically died but were being kept functioning through artificial respiration, an early form of life support used not to heal but to extend suffering. Death wasn't the end of usefulness, just another variable to be controlled. The archives also contain evidence of direct imperial involvement that Japanese authorities have long denied. Communications between Unit 731 leadership and Tokyo show that experimental results were regularly shared with imperial headquarters, with specific findings requested by military leadership. One document outlines a visit by imperial family representatives in 1943, including a tour of facilities and demonstration of bacterial culture techniques. The Emperor's chrysanthemum seal appears on funding approvals for biological weapons development. These documents remain politically radioactive, with full access still restricted by Russian authorities, partially for legitimate biological safety concerns, as some files contain actual sealed samples of biological agents, and partially because they remain useful diplomatic leverage against Japan. Copies of selected documents have been shared with Chinese authorities and international researchers, forming the backbone of evidence that eventually forced Japan's reluctant acknowledgement of Unit 731's existence. The Soviet archive stands as a paper monument to atrocities that their perpetrators tried to burn, bury, and forget, proof that even the most organized criminals sometimes drop evidence at the scene, and sometimes, decades later, the evidence speaks with the voices of those who couldn't speak for themselves. Survivors' testimony at war crimes trials. Think your medical anxiety is bad? Imagine testifying about doctors who removed your organs while you watched. Welcome to the Khabarovsk war crime trials of 1949, where survivors of Unit 731 got to relive their nightmares for a Soviet judicial audience, while America pretended not to hear their screams. The trials were a Russian production with limited Western press coverage. 12 Japanese defendants, including generals, doctors, and lab technicians, sat impassively while victims described their torment in excruciating details. The Soviets, never missing a propaganda opportunity, made sure every horrific syllable was carefully recorded and distributed. But propaganda doesn't make testimony false. Sometimes truth is the most powerful propaganda of all. One survivor described being infected with plague alongside 30 other prisoners. They injected something into my arm. Within hours, I burned with fever. The doctors checked my symptoms 3 times daily, measuring how quickly the disease progressed. Of the 30 in my group, I was one of only 4 who didn't die. Her testimony included watching researchers make bets on which patients would die first. A macabre office pool with human lives as the stakes. Medical professionals transforming suffering into entertainment while taking notes. The most gut-wrenching testimony came from Li Xiuying, who survived multiple procedures. They removed pieces of my liver without anesthesia. I could see my own blood pumping out with each heartbeat. The doctor smoked a cigarette while waiting for me to die, but somehow I didn't. Li showed the court her scars, a roadmap of medical sadism carved across her torso. Several judges reportedly had to look away. The doctors never did. Perhaps most disturbing was testimony from mothers who watched their children used as test subjects. They injected my 5-year-old daughter with something that made her skin turn yellow. She died screaming in my arms while they took notes. Then they asked if I would prefer an injection or gas for my own experiment. Imagine watching your child die in agony, then being asked your preference for how you'd like to join them. The defendants offered little defense beyond following orders and advancing medical knowledge. When confronted with their own laboratory notes documenting victims' suffering, many claimed selective amnesia. One doctor, when shown photographs of vivisection procedures that included his face in the frame, claimed he must have been observing, not participating, despite the images clearly showing his hands holding surgical instruments inside the victim's open chest cavity. The Soviet court sentenced most defendants to labor camps, sentences that many Americans dismissed as communist show trials. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, America was busy cutting deals with the unit's leadership to obtain their research findings. Justice wasn't just blind. It was actively looking the other way while counting its new biological weapons. The survivors' testimony had lasting impact mainly in China and Russia. Western powers, including America, largely ignored it, finding it more convenient to view the proceedings as Soviet propaganda rather than the inconvenient truth. The victims' voices were heard, but not listened to. Their suffering acknowledged only where it served political purposes. But what they described in those courtrooms was more than evidence of crimes. It was a warning about what happens when medicine divorces itself from ethics, when doctors become researchers and patients become subjects. It was a warning we chose not to hear. U.S. grant of immunity in exchange for data. How much is a war crime worth? According to the U.S. government circa 1947, exactly 1 thick folder of biological warfare research, and not a penny more. America's deal with Unit 731's leadership represents perhaps history's most morally bankrupt bargain hunting spree. Atrocity data at discount prices, with immunity thrown in as a bonus. Why punish war criminals when you can hire them instead? The arrangement was spearheaded by General Douglas MacArthur and microbiologist Dr. Edwin Hill, who reviewed preliminary Unit 731 research and concluded it was an intelligence goldmine. Rather than prosecute these scientists as war criminals, they lobbied Washington to offer a different deal: complete immunity in exchange for exclusive access to their experimental data. Nothing says justice like letting torturers go free because their torture yielded interesting scientific tables. The American logic was coldly pragmatic. The Soviets were advancing their own biological weapons program, and Unit 731's research represented years of data that would otherwise take decades to replicate, ethically or otherwise. As one military intelligence memo put it, information has proven invaluable for advancing current U.S. defensive capabilities against potential Soviet biological attack. Translation: war crimes become acceptable, they help us build better weapons than our enemy. The immunity deal remained classified until the 1980s, when documents began leaking out like a slow-motion hemorrhage of national conscience. Dr. Murray Sanders, who participated in the immunity negotiations, later expressed profound regret. "I was so naive. I thought these people were going to be tried for their crimes. Instead, I helped them escape justice." 2 decades after the war, Sanders began drinking heavily, telling friends he couldn't wash the blood from his hands. Unlike Unit 731's doctors, at least someone felt dirty. The arrangement's details were grotesque in their transactional nature. Unit 731 leaders were required to provide comprehensive research notes, participate in technical interviews, and demonstrate specific techniques. In return, they received not only immunity from prosecution, but often transportation, living expenses, and in some cases, continued employment as consultants. The price of justice? Apparently about the cost of a first-class ticket to America and a nice suburban house. The deal's darkest irony? In 1969, President Nixon renounced America's offensive biological weapons program, effectively rendering worthless the research that had purchased these criminals' freedom. The victims died twice, once in the experiments, and again when justice was denied them in exchange for data that would ultimately be abandoned. As one Fort Detrick scientist later admitted, "We got a bargain, but I've never been comfortable with the price." This wasn't just a failure of justice. It was active obstruction of justice in pursuit of national advantage. America didn't just look away from atrocity, it rewarded it. And the shadow of that decision still hangs over international law today. If the worst crimes can be forgiven for the right price, is anything truly forbidden? Shirō Ishii's escape from prosecution. Shirō Ishii's post-war life reads like a supervillain's retirement plan, complete with costume changes, secret identities, and inexplicable immunity from consequences. History's most successful war criminal managed to reinvent himself from Japan's Mengele to helpful scientific consultant faster than you can say selective justice. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Ishii immediately implemented his escape strategy with the precision he'd applied to his experiments. First, he faked his own death, complete with a false grave and funeral. When American investigators arrived in Japan, Ishii was officially dead, while actually just casually tending crops a few hundred miles away. His ruse unraveled when several captured Unit 731 members identified him as still alive. Rather than panic, Ishii pivoted to Plan B, negotiate from a position of ghoulish strength. He approached American authorities with a deal they couldn't refuse. Thousands of pages of unique biological warfare research in exchange for immunity. A business deal where the merchandise was data harvested from human suffering, and the payment was freedom. America, ever the practical shopper, agreed to Ishii's terms with almost indecent eagerness. Ishii didn't just offer research notes, he provided personal consulting services. He made multiple trips to Camp Detrick, now Fort Detrick, America's biological research center, where he lectured American scientists on his findings. Picture survivors of experiments watching this monster receiving first-class tickets to America while they struggled with physical and psychological wounds that would never heal. Imagine him standing in front of a blackboard, explaining exactly how long it takes for gangrene to develop in a frostbitten limb, based on his extensive field studies. Perhaps most shocking was Ishii's later life. He became a religious man, converting to Christianity in 1959 and frequently attending church. Former neighbors described him as quiet and generous. The butcher of Pingfang found more redemption in baptism than justice ever provided. Apparently, the blood of thousands washes off more easily than you'd think. When he developed throat cancer in 1959, Ishii received top-notch medical care. The cruel irony being that many of his treatments were developed using data from his own experiments. He died in 1959, having never spent a single day in prison or faced a single charge for his crimes. He died in a clean hospital bed, surrounded by medical professionals committed to saving his life. a courtesy he never extended to a single one of his victims. His final years were spent writing his memoirs, which were never published for obvious reasons, and collecting insects, presumably not plague-infected ones this time. His gravestone in Tokyo bears only his name and dates. No mention of the estimated 400,000 lives his work destroyed. No acknowledgement that the man buried there had once compared living human beings to logs and treated them accordingly. As one Chinese survivor bitterly noted, Ishii died peacefully in a bed. None of his victims had that luxury. His body was interred with dignity, unlike the bodies of those he used as laboratory equipment. Perhaps the most perfect crime isn't getting away with murder. It's getting others to protect you because your murder was scientifically interesting. Integration of research into the U.S. Biological Warfare Program. America's Fort Detrick scientists unwrapped Unit 731's research like kids on Christmas morning, eager to play with their new toys regardless of how those toys were made. The integration of Japanese biological warfare research into America's program represents one of history's most morally compromised technology transfers. Knowledge literally written in blood, transferred to sterile American laboratories with the fingerprints wiped clean. The data arrived in stages throughout the late 1940s. Detailed laboratory notes, statistical analyses, autopsy reports, and epidemic deployment strategies. American microbiologists were particularly interested in Japan's work on anthrax, plague, and tularemia, diseases that killed efficiently and could be weaponized effectively. The research was so valuable that it altered the entire trajectory of America's biological weapons development, saving an estimated 20 years of research time and millions in funding. Nothing accelerates scientific progress quite like removing those pesky ethical guardrails. Fort Detrick scientists weren't just passive recipients of paperwork. They conducted extensive interviews with Unit 731 personnel, including demonstrations of specialized equipment and techniques. Japanese researchers showed Americans their methods for freeze-drying bacteria, mass-producing pathogens, and designing delivery systems optimized for maximum civilian casualties. One American biologist described these sessions as technically brilliant but morally nauseating, yet the nausea didn't stop the note-taking. The most valuable research concerned casualty projections, statistical models showing how biological agents would spread through civilian populations. These models weren't theoretical. They were based on actual field tests conducted in Chinese villages. American analysts gained access to precise data on infection rates, mortality timelines, and optimal disposal procedures for contaminated bodies. All it cost was turning a blind eye to how these numbers were obtained. The screams conveniently edited out of the reports. By 1951, America had incorporated Unit 731's findings into its own biological arsenal. The U.S. developed cluster bombs designed to release infected insects over enemy territory, a direct adaptation of Japanese designs. Field tests conducted in Utah and Mississippi, using harmless bacteria as simulants, utilized dispersal patterns refined from Unit 731's work. The weapon had different names, but identical DNA. Perhaps most disturbing was the integration of medical treatment protocols. By the time President Nixon shut down the offensive biological weapons program in 1969, Unit 731's scientific legacy had been thoroughly absorbed into American military thinking. The knowledge couldn't be unlearned, even as the weapons themselves were dismantled. The ethical contamination remained, like a biological agent that can't be fully neutralized. As one Fort Detrick scientist later reflected, we told ourselves we were using bad science for good purposes. But I wonder if that's what they told themselves too. The line between researcher and monster had been blurred, not by accident, but by deliberate choice. America hadn't just acquired data, it had acquired a methodology, an approach to science that separated progress from humanity. And that may be Unit 731's most lasting weapon, the idea that knowledge justifies its own creation, regardless of the cost. Many Unit 731 doctors became prominent post-war medical professionals. After spending years conducting experiments that would make Frankenstein vomit, most Unit 731 doctors did what any respectable war criminal would do. They became respected pillars of Japanese society. Because nothing says qualified medical professional quite like having extensive experience removing people's organs while they're still using them. Dr. Masashi Kitano, who succeeded Ishii as Unit 731's commander, founded Japan's largest pharmaceutical company, Green Cross Corporation. His specialty at Unit 731 was plague research, which apparently translated nicely to developing blood products. In a twist of karmic justice, Green Cross later caused Japan's worst medical scandal by selling HIV-contaminated blood products, proving that ethical corners never stop being cut once you start. The man who once infected prisoners with bubonic plague just to watch what happened later provided blood products to Japanese hospitals. Think about that next time you get an IV. Dr. Ryoichi Naito, who supervised countless vivisections, established the Japan Blood Bank, which later became the Japanese pharmaceutical giant Midori Juji. His business model was simple: apply mass production techniques from Unit 731's bacteria cultivation to the commercial blood industry. Thousands of Japanese patients unknowingly received treatments developed by a man who would watch children die in pressure chambers. Their blood passed through systems designed by hands that had once been inside living, conscious victims. The academic world welcomed these butchers with open arms and no background checks. Dr. Hisato Yoshimura, who specialized in freezing prisoners until their limbs shattered like glass, became a professor at Kyoto University. His research on frostbite was published in respected medical journals, with no mention of his research methods, of course. He received multiple academic awards and trained a generation of new doctors, none of whom were told about their mentor's extracurricular activities in Manchuria. His lectures on tissue damage from cold exposure were based on watching hundreds of people freeze to death while he took notes. Dr. Masami Kitaoka, who infected prisoners with various pathogens to study disease progression, joined Japan's National Institute of Health. From there, he advised on public health policies, occasionally attending international conferences where he likely rubbed shoulders with Chinese doctors treating the long-term victims of his experiments. The man who once released plague-infected fleas into enclosed chambers containing bound prisoners later helped design Japan's disease control protocols. Perhaps most grotesque was Dr. Shirō Ishii's cousin, Takeo Ishii, who conducted experiments on pregnant women. He established a successful obstetrics and gynecology practice in Tokyo after the war. Imagine delivering your baby with a doctor whose previous experience involved dissecting pregnant women to study how diseases cross the placental barrier. Imagine those same hands that once removed living fetuses from conscious mothers now gently guiding new life into the world. Some stains don't wash off, they just become invisible. The Japanese medical establishment created a protective bubble around these men. When journalists asked uncomfortable questions, medical societies closed ranks. Academic institutions buried inconvenient histories. Patient consent forms notably lacked the question, is it acceptable if your doctor previously experimented on unwilling human subjects? After all, what patients don't know can't hurt them. Unlike what these doctors' previous patients learned the hard way. By the 1990s, when Japan finally began acknowledging Unit 731's existence, many of these doctors had lived full, prosperous lives, dying of old age in comfortable beds, a courtesy they never extended to their victims. Their children attended the best schools, their families prospered, and their contributions to medicine were celebrated, all built on foundations of unmourned suffering. As one survivor bitterly noted, they built careers on our suffering, and no one ever asked them to explain the gaps in their resumes. Their victims died in agony, while they died with honors. If there's a more perfect injustice, history has yet to record it. Suppression of war crimes data in post-war trials. Despite being the largest biological warfare program in history, Unit 731 barely rated a footnote in post-war justice proceedings. This wasn't an oversight. It was a carefully orchestrated vanishing act, history being rewritten while the ink was still wet on the first draft. When prosecutors attempted to introduce evidence about biological experimentation, they hit a wall of American opposition. Lead prosecutor Joseph Keenan, acting on direct orders from the US government, systematically blocked testimonies from Chinese and Soviet witnesses who had first-hand knowledge of Unit 731 activities. Every time biological warfare emerged in testimony, objections were raised, topics were changed, and judges mysteriously decided these matters were outside the scope of the proceedings. Justice wasn't blind, it was being actively blindfolded. The Soviets, never one to miss an opportunity to highlight Western hypocrisy, repeatedly tried to introduce Unit 731 evidence. Their representative, Judge Pal, submitted extensive documentation that was promptly classified and removed from public records. When pressed about these omissions, American officials cited national security concerns, the all-purpose umbrella for covering up inconvenient atrocities. National security, protecting the nation from the truth about what it was willing to accept. Most shocking was America withholding key witnesses. When the prosecution sought testimony from Unit 731 members, they discovered these individuals were suddenly unavailable, often because they were literally in the United States, giving technical briefings to Fort Detrick scientists. Several researchers were actually in Tokyo during the trials, staying in American military housing while providing biological warfare consultation to their new employers. The criminals weren't hiding, they were working for the judges. Chinese victims who traveled to Tokyo to testify found their visa applications mysteriously delayed or denied. Those who made it to Japan were told their testimony would be considered, but never actually called to the stand. One survivor, who had been infected with plague and somehow lived, waited 3 weeks in a Tokyo hotel before being informed his presence would not be required. Imagine surviving medical torture only to be told your story isn't relevant to the trial of your torturers. The trial transcripts revealed bizarre gaps in questioning that looked like holes cut in a document. When General Otoza Yamada, commander of the Kwantung Army that oversaw Unit 731, testified, prosecutors asked detailed questions about troop movements and battle plans, but conspicuously avoided any mention of biological warfare operations under his command. The oversight was so obvious that even Japanese defense attorneys were confused by the omission. It wasn't just that certain questions weren't asked, it was as if those questions couldn't exist. Perhaps most damning was the lost evidence. Thousands of pages of Unit 731 documents captured by American forces simply vanished from evidence logs. Photographs of experimental victims, detailed laboratory notes, and field test results all conveniently misplaced before they could be entered into the public record. Evidence didn't just disappear. It was disappeared, with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. When the trials concluded in 1948, not a single person had been charged specifically for biological warfare crimes or human experimentation. The verdict documents contain only vague references to conventional atrocities, as if removing someone's lungs while they're still breathing is just a routine war crime. Nothing special to see here. As one frustrated prosecutor later noted, "We didn't just fail to deliver justice. We actively prevented it. This wasn't just a miscarriage of justice. It was justice aborted before it could even take its first breath. Losing humanity for the betterment of humanity." And now we reach the true bottom of the iceberg. Not just what happened, but what it means. The scariest part isn't just the crimes, or even the people that got away with them. It's that we're still living in a world shaped by them. Medical advancements don't come with a disclaimer saying tested on unwilling subjects. Nobody asks where the data came from, just whether it works. And when history gets too uncomfortable, it quietly fades into, well, that was a long time ago. But was it? What makes us so sure something like this couldn't happen again? That another group, another government, won't decide that the pursuit of knowledge justifies the suffering of a few, or a few thousand. Because here's the real horror. Every atrocity in history was committed by people who thought they were justified. And every time we assume we're better than them, we take one step closer to proving that we aren't.